In this section, we'll look at some of the political problems and pressure FDR faced as he wound down his first early New Deal. By 1935, the unemployment rate had definitely come down, but it was still almost 20% and was way too high and engendered a lot of criticism. There are also problems becoming apparent with the National Recovery Administration, the NRA, and its codes of fair competition. You'll recall that the codes were written by industry, and the people that writing the industry were writing the industry codes were the large industries, and small businesses complained that these big large industries were dominating the code writing in a way that helped the large industries at the expense of the smaller competition. Moreover, because the NRA was relying on self-regulation, many codes weren't adequately enforced. Section 7A of the NRA gave workers the right to unionize, but companies were smart and they got around it by starting their own company unions and then controlling their own union. I think the best examples of the problems of the NRA is simply the fact that the code writing process has become bogged down in regulating trivial matters. The women's clothing shoulder pad industry, for example, had its own code. The burlesque house owners adopted codes that specified the degree of nudity of their strippers. It all reached the level of the absurd. In response to the criticism of the NRA, FDR forced Hugh Johnson to leave as its director and created a National Recovery Review Board. To lead this investigative board, he picked the famed lawyer Clarence Darrow, known of course for the Scopes trial. Darrow's job was to investigate the problems of the NRA, but he acted more like a prosecutor than an impartial investigator, and the result was it really increased criticism of the NRA. Meanwhile, the Agricultural Adjustment Act had raised farm prices. It raised them an astounding 50% by 1937, but nevertheless, the AAA had its own problems and faced criticism too. Raising the farm income would of course mean higher prices for food, and the consumers didn't like that. Moreover, the idea of limiting production when people were still hungry, as I suggested before, still seemed illogical to people. I think the best example of the problem with the AAA, however, was in the problem of sharecroppers and tenant farmers. They did not own the land they farmed, and when the government wanted the farmers to cut back production, it would send a check to the landowner, a subsidy to the landowner. The money would go to the landowner, who then simply would tell the sharecroppers farming his land to get off, and so the sharecroppers and tenant farmers kind of got screwed in the end. The sharecroppers and tenant farmers tried to protest, forming the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, but it wasn't that successful. The large landowners, fearing that their checks might vanish, really violently struck back at the union, and moreover the union tried to unite poor rural farmers, both black and white, and that's always a difficult thing to do in the South. By the end of the first early New Deal in 1935, you really see conservatives beginning to coalesce into new political groups like the American Liberty League, which basically blasted FDR at every opportunity it got. It said that the New Deal was an affront to individual freedom and it would lead to communism. It was help funded. It got funding from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Criticism from the political right, those who thought that he'd done too much, wasn't really surprising to FDR. He expected something like the American Liberty League. What was worrisome in 1935 was criticism from the political left, from those in his own party who said not that he'd done too much, but rather he hadn't done enough. Remember, unemployment was still unacceptably high. The best example of this was a former Louisiana governor named Huey Long, who was known as Kingfish. Huey Long was flamboyant and outspoken, but he was smart to realize that the people were upset at the wealthy. And in Louisiana, there's a lot of wealthy with the oil and utilities and the banking industry. And what he did as governor was he taxed them very heavily and built a lot of infrastructure. He built hospitals and bridges and over 3,300 miles of roads. So he was popular. He was incredibly flamboyant and outspoken, and in fact, he was personally corrupt. He there's a box that all state employees had to contribute in, and nobody quite knew where the money went. But just say Huey Long lived a bit more lavishly than his salary would allow for. When Huey Long moved to the Senate, he remained sort of a dictator in Louisiana. He controlled the governor and ran roughshod over the local governments. People put up with it because they believed he was fighting for the common man. He was getting things done. By 1935, Long was beginning to have presidential ambitions. He either wanted to replace FDR as the Democratic nominee or perhaps run as an independent in a third party in 1936. Huey Long had a plan which he called Share Our Wealth Plan. The idea was to restrict huge fortunes. Everyone could own $1 million, but there'd be heavy progressive taxation on incomes above that. All incomes and inheritance over $5 million would be confiscated. Now, with all that money coming in, the Share Our Wealth Plan would guarantee every family a $5,000 allowance, or every worker between $2,000 and $2,500 income. The Share Our Wealth Plan called for government funding of the elderly and veterans and all public works. It was popular in the Depression because there were a lot of poor people, and the Long began to form Share Our Wealth Clubs, and this was a lot more than anything that FDR had proposed. Only a month after announcing his candidacy for the presidency in 1935, Long was assassinated by a guy angry at his power in Louisiana. And while Long's death removed the personal political threat to FDR, Long's candidacy still demonstrated wide demand for activism. It demonstrated that Americans still wanted FDR to do more. Another critic was Dr. Francis Townsend, who argued that FDR hadn't done much to help the elderly. You know, if someone worked their entire lives, they put their money in the bank, did everything they should, they lost everything overnight, and they couldn't. They're too old to work in the works program. So FDR hadn't done anything for them, and that upset Francis Townsend. He proposed, therefore, what became known as the Townsend Plan. The idea was to give $200 a month pension to everybody over the age of 60 on the condition that they spend the money within a month. And that would help the old person, but it would also stimulate the economy. Townsend started a radio program which became very popular, sort of an early version of talk radio, but he just told his listeners to call the congressman. By 1935, the supporters had formed Townsend Clubs, and they claimed almost 5 million members. Another critic who said that FDR hadn't done enough was the Catholic priest Charles Coughlin from the Detroit suburbs. Like Townsend, Coughlin began discussing politics on his radio show, in his case, religious sermons. And he hated big business. He ran it against the wealthy industrialists and advocating a much far-reacher program of financial socialization. He wanted massive currency inflation and, really an attack on the bankers way beyond anything that FDR had proposed. He, by the way, was a bit anti-Semitic, showing that, blaming the banks were controlled by the Jews, showing that anti-Semitism wasn't just in Germany at the time. Coughlin formed the National Union for Social Justice, which really upset FDR because in the first early New Deal, you recall, FDR was planning to cooperate with big business and industry. He was not that coercive and looking at self-regulation. He didn't want to anger them, and Father Coughlin was really ticking them off. Of course, there was the Communist and Socialist parties. The Communist Party, more directly controlled by Moscow, still advocated a world revolution, and with the Depression and all the misery, it actually, as I've said before, had close to 100,000 members. The Socialist Party didn't advocate a revolution as much as it did increased government activism, government ownership of certain industries, and it had found that its membership actually dropped. It fell to less than 20,000 people, in part because FDR's activism and the advocacy of people like Townsend and Coughlin sort of took some of the wind out of its sails. This concludes this section on some of the political problems and pressures that FDR faced as he wound down his first early New Deal.